As part of the series of Keys to Mount Aventine, this video summarizes a 2024 report on enslavement at the former Pomonkey and Mount Aventine plantations. The report was made possible by a grant from the state of Maryland, which was managed by St. Mary's College of Maryland with the help of the Friends of Chapman State Park and other community groups. Mount Aventine is the manor house of the former Chapman Plantation that is now Chapman State Park, operating under the auspices of the state's Department of Natural Resources and the Maryland Park Service. When Nathaniel Chapman purchased the 530-acre Grimes Ditch property in 1751, the plantation became a destination for people taken from Africa, the West Indies, and other American colonies. They arrived in bondage and typically in Charles County through Port Tobacco, Nanjemoy, Cedar Point, and Benedict. Chapman, like many other enslavers, used the free enslaved labor to build his plantation house and farm the surrounding land. The Pomonkey house was similar to George Mason's house at Gunston Hall. The house was named after the Pomonkey Native American tribe who lived in this area in the early 17th century. Surviving records suggest that the house was built by 3 enslaved men named Port, Anthony, and Jamie Smith. A 1761 goods and chattel of Nathaniel Chapman inventory lists the names of 30 enslaved people and their families. Within that list, Ancilla and Suzanne are indicated as mothers of at least 2 children. In addition to possessing construction skills, enslaved people were involved with felling trees for lumber, managing livestock, farming corn and tobacco, housekeeping, and working in the plantation's ferry and fishery businesses, which began respectively in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Between 1790 and 1860, both the enslaved and free populations in Charles County declined in numbers. Many poorer whites left to find better opportunities elsewhere, and many enslaved blacks were either freed or sold to the Deep South. By the onset of the Civil War in 1861, the county's enslaved population was over 20% larger than the free population. Chapman's enslaved population varied over time, often moving between the Virginia and Maryland locales based on changing circumstances with the Chapmans. In 1790, the U.S. Census listed 38 enslaved people living on the property. By 1830, Nathaniel Chapman's great-grandson Pearson enslaved 36 people. The number of enslaved residents at Chapman then fell to 10 in 1840, before rising to 26 in 1850, and falling again to 21 by 1860. The Pomonkey house fell into disrepair and was abandoned after 1844, and today some scattered bricks from the foundation and daffodils are the only remaining evidence of the original house. Pomonkey was replaced with the present-day Mount Aventine Manor House. Nathaniel Chapman's great-grandson Pearson oversaw its construction beginning in 1830. During the time of Pearson Chapman, there were a total of 6 domestic quarters to house the 21 enslaved individuals on the property. Pearson Chapman may have followed the Sotterley model, locating the quarters at the foot of the slope below Mount Aventine, which was built on a bluff overlooking the Potomac River. The domestic quarters would have been in 1 or 2 rows and perpendicular to Mount Aventine. This way, Pearson could have kept an eye on the enslaved people while still not interrupting his viewshed. The domestic quarters in Mount Aventine may have also been located west of the non-extant smokehouse or off of the east side of the house in a symmetrical manner. The symmetry theory, however, is questioned because Mount Aventine was asymmetrical until around 1860. Evidence of quarters for enslaved people was noted in a 2024 field pedestrian survey by St. Mary's College, which uncovered signs of possible outbuildings such as domestic quarters. Identified were a stone pile, shards, and a depression marking the possible location of an ice house or coal pit for food storage. Ice houses were a way of keeping food cold in an underground pit, similar to how smokehouses were used for preserving meats before electricity and refrigeration. While no information exists that describes the quarters for enslaved people at Mount Aventine, records do exist for nearby plantations of similar size and scale, such as the log cabin or quarters from the Sotterley Plantation circa 1830. Log cabin type quarters were built based on family groups or kinship, housing 4 or more people. These were 1 or 2 bedroom quarters that seldom offered much warmth or shelter from harsh weather. They typically had dirt floors, minimal furnishings, and sometimes a cooking hearth. The floors often had pits excavated into the dirt floor to provide additional storage. Generally, these quarters offered only the most basic amenities, such as a bed which consisted of a straw-filled mattress and a thin blanket. The windows had no glass and usually only cloth coverings or sometimes shutters. The enslaved often had little time for themselves. However, some maintained small personal garden plots near their quarters. They grew their own food. They sometimes bartered and traded homemade beers and baked items. In some households, the enslaved crafted homemade musical instruments such as drums and fiddles made from dried gourds. A conch shell was sometimes cut off at the tip and used as a horn to welcome enslaved people to social events like communal meals, corn shuckings, and dances. These events allowed people from different plantations to connect. Marriages, though not legally binding the eyes of the enslavers, were an important social event. Enslavers encouraged marriages because they legally owned all of the children. Families could be severed when the enslaver moved or sold family members elsewhere. This made it difficult for enslaved people to sustain generational ties and families. Religious life was also important, as were burial practices. Many enslavers considered religious gatherings as places where escape or revolt plans were devised. In response, armed patrols of plantation owners were formed to monitor or prevent such gatherings from occurring. After slavery was abolished during the Civil War, the former enslaved residents either worked for the Chapmans as tenant farmers and laborers, purchased nearby plots and set up farms, or moved elsewhere. Thomas Brown became a freedman after the Civil War and built a log cabin dwelling for his family on a portion of the 25 acres near Mount Aventine, which he purchased from a landowner and former enslaver, Eugene Bronner. The freedmen and freedwomen formed new communities in Bryan's Road, Pomonkey, and Indian Head, where their descendants continue to live today. The Federal Writers Project, created by the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, produced a series of oral histories of formerly enslaved men and women. Selected interviews with 4 Charles County persons were used in the St. Mary's College study as insight into the lives of enslaved persons. All 4 of the interviewees used for the report were born and raised close to the Chapman Plantation, including one who grew up in Pisgah, 5 miles south of Mount Aventine. It is thought that the Chapman family cemetery may also contain interments of enslaved persons. George Chapman indicated in his 1817 will that the family cemetery was 1/4 acre near the foot of the garden of the Pomonkey house. The current boundary markers, though, indicate the cemetery to be far smaller in size, implying that the markers may not be correct. A ground-penetrating radar survey was conducted by the Friends of Chapman State Park in 2019. The survey, though, was not successful in identifying any additional graves beyond the immediate cemetery. Nevertheless, the St. Mary's Pedestrian Survey suggested that the clusters of daffodils, a favorite plant for cemeteries, identified in the wooded area to the east of the formal boundaries of the cemetery as a possible location where enslaved people may be interred. However, this theory is questioned, as it would place these graves between the Pomonkey house and the family cemetery. While efforts to locate a cemetery of the enslaved are ongoing, the actual location of the domestic quarters and burial sites for enslaved people at the Mount Aventine/Pomonkey Plantation may never be known.